Great to have you with us. Please like, subscribe, and share. Now, with that, I want to dive into a much darker story, but one that has a good beginning. And that good beginning is Donald Trump signed an executive order today that I think is of huge importance. This was an executive order that essentially redoes some things from back in before the Obama administration. Things that were essentially put in place because they were undone. They were done. It's a long storied history of gain of function research. Donald Trump signed an executive order today banning gain of function research, putting severe penalties in place for trying to outsource it to other nations. All the things that Fauci did, all the things that the global establishment, administrative state did to try to outsource this to escape American scrutiny. This stuff was outlawed a long time ago, but it was brought back in by that disgusting bill that was passed during the Bush, a Rhino Republican administration, the Patriot Act, which is the bane of our existence, the bane against the Constitution, the bane against American freedom. The Patriot Act, which brought it back into style. Obama had basically outlawed it, had put some constraints on it that obviously Biden and everybody else just ignored. And then it became huge. They used the global administrative state, used that to drive COVID, to basically attack the Trump presidency, destroy the economy before the election. Well, Trump outlawed it today, and we've got a whole series of events that are taking place around this. It's brought this whole situation, this whole story back into the limelight. So let's start with Trump signing the executive order.
Bobby, do you have anything to say? We signed some very important documents having to do with health. Do you have anything to say?
Mr. President, gain of function is an historic day, the end of gain of function research funding by the federal government and also controls by private corporations on gain of function studies. This was the kind of study that was engaged in by the United States military and intelligence agencies beginning in 1947. By 1969, the CIA said that they had reached nuclear equivalency, that they could kill the entire U.S. population for 29 cents per person. That year, President Nixon went to Fort Detrick and announced a unilateral end to this kind of research, what they called dual-use research, research that was for vaccination and also for military purposes. He then persuaded over 180 countries to sign the Bioweapons Charter in 1973. That basically ended gain of function research on the globe until 2002. Or 2001, after the anthrax attacks, we passed the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act had a provision, a little-known provision in it, that said that although the Bioweapons Charter is still in effect, and the Geneva Convention is still in effect, U.S. federal officials who violate it cannot be prosecuted. And that relaunched a bioweapons arms race, and that was driven by gain of function research.
So as we talked about, gain of function research was essentially dead and buried until that disgusting bill, the Patriot Act, that abomination that never should have been passed, but here we are, brought it back, allowed some loopholes that brought it right back into the public square. And here we are.
3 of those bugs escaped from U.S. labs, and President Obama declared a moratorium on future use. And instead, a lot of that research was moved offshore to the Wuhan lab. And it launched bioweapons arms race all around the country, all around the world, so that China's engaged in it, developing all kinds of weapons using AI and CRISPR technologies that are really devastating. Russia is deeply engaged in it, Iran and many other countries. It's a kind of weapon that always has blowback. There's always bad news. And justification for this kind of weaponry and these kind of research was always that we have to do this to develop vaccines to counter a future pandemic. In all of the
which is completely ridiculous when you think about it. Because, okay, so we're going to do gain of function research to develop vaccines so that we can counter these bioweapons in the future. Well, unless you happen to know what bioweapons they're working on, your vaccine is useless. All they have to do is tweak their formula, tweak their bioweapon just a little bit, and your vaccine doesn't work. So the idea that we're going to do this to develop vaccines, unless you're developing 1,000,001 vaccines, so that you have almost every possibility covered, which you could never do. It's a ridiculous panning statement. Then the idea is utter nonsense. You're going to have to, unless you're going to have to do something where you can begin to fast track vaccinations, and not the kind that they did during COVID, this mRNA nonsense, which clearly has not been effective. But anyway, so we've got this going on. Well, this has brought this entire story back into the forefront. And there were two things that happened recently that I want to get to. Benny Johnson revealed on his show something that happened to him at the beginning of the COVID nonsense 4 years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, back when COVID first started in 2019 and 2020. I want to play that clip. And then I want to get into, we've got a whistleblower that essentially has revealed that the US government knew. They knew that the clinical trials that Pfizer was putting forth were faked. They were nonsense. They were garbage. They were fraudulent. So we want to get into that clip as well, because this goes back to the entire Biden administration when they mandated this vaccine, when they gave when Fauci and everybody else gave everybody this emergency use authorization. They knew what they were doing was putting a harmful experimental chemical in people's bodies, and that never should have happened. This is Dr. Mengele stuff. All right, let's dive into this clip from Benny Johnson, which I thought was extremely eye-opening. For those of you who don't like Pompeo and don't like Pence, this is going to be right up your alley.
Here it is. How deep was the attack against President Trump? I don't think I have any pictures of it. I'd have to check. But I was invited to Mike Pompeo's office. And right at the beginning of COVID, I got invitations to meet with Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo. Now, you're an influencer, you're somebody with a podcast, you have social media presence. This is not totally, this is kind of like normal, right? It's not completely out of the blue, but I'd never met with these guys before, right?
So at the beginning of the pandemic, he gets invited to meet Pompeo and Pence. This is going to get interesting. Let's keep going.
They weren't my friends. Mike Pence wasn't my friend. Mike Pompeo, I didn't know Mike Pompeo. He was Secretary of State at the time. But for some reason, right when COVID launched, he decided to haul in big-time Trump people to go meet with these two guys. And what did both of them tell me? Both of them told me in these secret meetings, these little private meetings, that what's going to happen is we're going to have to shut down the economy. Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo both told me that. Why? I'm just telling you what happened. And that shocked me. I remember going home to my wife and saying,
think about that. So it's two people you've never met. You've never interviewed them other than at outside events. You've never been called into their office. Call you in as an influencer and say, we're going to have to shut down the economy. What are you talking about? We're talking about, at the time, COVID was a nothing burger. Remember, and this is what I always remembered about the coronavirus issue when it first started. If any of you remember, there was a cruise ship basically populated with retirees that they discovered, somebody tested positive, and they stuck that cruise ship miles out from shore and let nobody on or off for about 2 weeks. That cruise ship was out there, and the COVID virus just festered. It went through everybody, including retirees. Most of the people on that cruise ship were 60 or older, a high risk group. There were at least 2 people on that cruise ship that were on, at the time, anti-rejection medication for transplants. And if you remember, this is what always struck me when all of the death counts started rolling and the idea of the pandemic, and this was so horrible and we have to shut everything down. I kept going back to that cruise ship going, wait a minute. When this wasn't a thing and that cruise ship, everybody got COVID, nobody died. Nobody's on a respirator. There was very little adverse effects at all. People got the flu. It lasted for a couple of weeks and then they got off. There were no reports of serious medical problems or deaths from that cruise ship. And yet, somehow, this morphed into the greatest threat to mankind in modern history. I kept going back to that cruise ship, and I kept thinking to myself, this is a scam. This is not real. Something is going on here. Here we go.
The most insane thing just happened. You're never going to believe it. But Mike Pompeo just told me that we're going to have to shut down the economy because of COVID? What the hell is this? And lo and behold, ladies and gentlemen, here we are, sitting on the outset of 4 years from the total complete shutdown of the economy, destruction of President Trump's first term, and you got to ask yourself, was Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo colluding with the deep state to destroy their boss? Was this treason?
Yes, that's what I'm just going to call a spade. Yes, especially considering their actions and their words after the fact. This is the same Mike Pence who turned completely turncoat against Trump, suddenly started attacking him over the nonsense J6 crap, who in an interview with Tucker Carlson, when talking about, what was happening to American cities versus what we needed to do for Ukraine, basically said, Americans, they're not my concern. We need to give money to Ukraine. I remember that over Americans, they're not my concern. That's not my problem. They're not my problem. Americans aren't my problem. America's not my problem. We need to give money to Ukraine. He was a deep state stooge. Probably not allowed to use that word. He was an administrative state stooge. It's exactly what he was. I think he was a traitor. That's my personal opinion.
Something that we look forward to asking General Flynn. He'll be on the program soon. But was this treason? Did they get to them? And now you've seen, obviously, the motions of Pompeo, the movements of Pompeo and Pence afterwards, after this. And you got to say, yeah, totally, completely.
Yeah, totally, completely. And there was more than just them in on the scam. This was the other story I uncovered around this same topic that I think you need to see. Here's a woman who was employed essentially by a subcontractor to Pfizer, who was in charge of their clinical trials for the coronavirus vaccine. Check this out.
I am absolutely shocked at the outcome that we just heard about, and I want to talk about that with you. But for anyone who isn't familiar with your story and this case, can you give them a brief overview, please?
Sure. This is, I feel like it's been a long time since we last spoke, but this case is going on 5 years now. I was a regional director overseeing clinical trial sites in Pfizer's COVID-19 clinical trial for their vaccine. When I was working on the trial, I reported not only to my company, but eventually to the FDA, irregularities, violations of protocol, things that could potentially affect the integrity of the overall safety and efficacy data of their trial. So that's kind of what started this for me. I contacted the FDA at the end of September of 2020, and about 6 hours later, I was fired for, what was their reason, Maria? I was not a good fit. I was not a good fit for reporting fraudulent conduct in a clinical trial. So go figure.
Can you just refresh everyone as to what you observed?
The list is so long. The first thing that I always try to remind people is what is so basic to me and important for patients is informed consent. If you're participating in a clinical trial, you want to be fully aware of what the study involves, what your risks are, what your responsibilities are as a patient. So that was key for me. Finding that we were not providing patients with full and informed consent was my number one concern and something I addressed immediately. I would say, top three, the second was not reporting adverse events, including those that were serious. We have an obligation to the patients to protect them. We need to follow those adverse events through their resolution. And my company was refusing to do that. We were so inundated with the number of adverse events that patients were reporting that we could not keep up with them. And we were actually, I took a call directly from Pfizer asking what our plan was as a company to hire more people to take these calls and emails, et cetera, to report back to the FDA these adverse events that were occurring on such a large scale. So that was another thing that I saw. And I was only employed with this company for 18 days. I do you know, they like to throw that in my face like it's you know,
This is amazing. The fact that Pfizer knew that this was a coordinated effort to essentially hide the truth. But it gets even bigger than that. And that is the fact that the government knew what was going on. The US government admitted something shocking. They knew Pfizer's COVID trials were a complete sham back in 2020. The Biden administration knew they were a scam. The government knew they were a scam. Everybody knew, everybody was in on the grift. The grift was destroy the Trump presidency, destroy the Trump economy, transfer trillions of dollars from Main Street to Wall Street and to the 1%, to the elites, to the establishment. It was also introduce control measures, part of which would destroy people's health over the long term. The whole thing was a scam. The whole thing was an op. And this is just absolutely disgusting. But this is what we're dealing with. This is what Trump, the level of the administrative state, the level of the treason that is the rot, the metastasizing cancer that is the federal government, that has to be cut out, that has to be rooted out, that has to be destroyed, that has to be irradiated. We have to go through a form of governmental chemo that is going to be extremely painful. People need to get ready for the fact that it's got to get worse before it gets better in a lot of cases. We have to get this rot out. And right now, you've got judges and you've got other people that are opposing Trump in doing this. We need to make sure these people get out of the way so that we can get rid of what has become a non-US, an anti-American, anti-Main Street, anti-American worker, anti-US globalist cabal inside of our own government. And we can see it clearly in what happened with coronavirus. We can see it clearly in what happens with the blob, the CIA, the DOD, and the State Department as they go around the world, starting wars, festering, fomenting internal conflict within countries, things like that. It's got to end. Now, we'll end that, but we'll be following up with this as we find out more. Obviously, we're waiting for James O'Keefe, who's going to be releasing something tomorrow. He's been teasing it with Epstein. He's been teasing it with Pfizer. Who knows? Maybe it's all linked together. I don't know. I'll be waiting with bated breath to see what O'Keefe reveals tomorrow. As you know, he went into hiding 7 days ago, basically said, I'm going to go off the grid. I'm going dark. I'm afraid for my life, and we'll be releasing in 7 days. Now, part of that's a marketing ploy because he wants people talking about it. Got it. It worked. But I want to see what he has to say.